Welcome back to Simple Mind Space, your go-to source for mastering your money and your mind. Today, we're tackling a topic that's been dominating headlines and sparking heated debates: inflation. Everyone's feeling the pinch at the pump and the grocery store. Prices are soaring, and it's got a lot of people feeling anxious. In fact, you'd have to go back to the 1970s to find a time when inflation was this big of a concern. Back then, the U.S. experienced what we now call the Great Inflation, a period of skyrocketing prices that crippled the economy. Naturally, the big question on everyone's mind is, are we headed for a repeat of the 1970s? Are we on the verge of another great inflation? To answer that, we need to understand what happened back then. The Great Inflation wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow burn that started in the 1960s. President Johnson's ambitious social programs, coupled with the escalating costs of the Vietnam War, fueled a steady rise in prices. Then came the 1970s. President Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard, a move that further weakened the dollar. The Federal Reserve, under pressure from the Nixon administration, kept interest rates artificially low and pumped more money into the economy. These actions, intended to stimulate growth, only fueled the inflationary fire. Adding fuel to this inferno was the OPEC oil embargo, which sent energy prices through the roof. Imagine the impact of gas prices quadrupling practically overnight. The result? Stagflation, a toxic cocktail of high inflation and high unemployment. People were losing their jobs while the cost of everything was skyrocketing. It wasn't until Paul Volcker took the helm at the Federal Reserve that the tide began to turn. Volcker implemented a series of aggressive interest rate hikes to curb inflation. While these measures were painful in the short term, leading to 2 recessions, they ultimately brought inflation under control. The lessons learned from the Great Inflation revolutionized the way the Federal Reserve approaches monetary policy. The Fed became laser-focused on maintaining price stability, adopting a 2% inflation target that remains the benchmark today. So, are we staring down the barrel of another great inflation? Not quite. While there are undeniable similarities, rising prices, increased government spending, and a more expansive monetary policy, the differences are significant. Firstly, the current rate of inflation, while high by recent standards, pales compared to the double-digit inflation experienced in the 1970s. We're talking about a 5% increase in prices compared to the staggering 15% witnessed at the peak of the Great Inflation. Secondly, the Federal Reserve has learned from the mistakes of the past. Today's Fed is far more proactive and independent than its 1970s counterpart. It has a clear mandate to control inflation and the tools to do so. Thirdly, the underlying causes of today's inflation are different. Much of the current inflationary pressure stems from supply chain disruptions and pent-up demand in the wake of the pandemic, not from reckless government spending or an unanchored monetary policy. The Fed believes that these inflationary pressures are transitory, likely to ease as supply chains normalize and demand stabilizes. However, they're also closely monitoring the situation, ready to act if inflation shows signs of becoming entrenched. In conclusion, while the specter of the 1970s inflation haunts our collective memory, the current economic landscape is vastly different. We're not facing a repeat of the Great Inflation, but a period of price adjustments as the economy recovers from the pandemic shock. The key takeaway is this: while some inflation is normal, even healthy, for a growing economy, uncontrolled inflation can be devastating. Understanding the lessons of the past, remaining informed about current economic conditions, and making sound financial decisions are crucial for navigating inflationary periods and ensuring your financial well-being. That's it for today's episode of Simple Mind Space. If you found this episode insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on all things finance and personal development. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving for your full potential.